The spring sun was already climbing high over the Montana territory when Clara Whitfield heard the desperate lowing of a cow in distress, and she dropped the water bucket she had been carrying to sprint toward the far pasture where their small herd grazed. It was April of 1882, and the land around the ranch was finally shaking off winter's grip, transforming into a sea of green dotted with wildflowers that swayed in the constant breeze. Clara's dark blonde hair came loose from its braid as she ran, her worn boots kicking up dust on the path that wound between the wooden fences her late father had built with his own hands just 3 years before his heart gave out. She found the heifer near the creek, pacing anxiously beside a newborn calf that lay in a crumpled heap on the ground, its coat still wet and matted from birth. The mother cow was young herself, probably experiencing her first calving, and she seemed uncertain about what to do next. Clara approached slowly, speaking in low, soothing tones that she had learned from her father during the years he had taught her everything about ranching. The heifer backed away a few steps, her large eyes watchful but not aggressive, and Clara knelt beside the calf in the soft grass. The little creature was breathing, which was the first good sign, but it made no attempt to rise. Clara ran her hands gently over its body, checking for injuries or deformities that might explain its stillness. Everything seemed intact, all 4 legs present and properly formed, but the calf was weak, perhaps from a difficult birth, or simply from being born smaller than it should have been. She had seen this before, these fragile new lives that needed just a little extra help to find their footing in the world. What Clara did not know was that she was being observed from the ridge above the pasture, where a man sat astride a tall buckskin horse, his weathered hands resting on the saddle horn as he watched the scene unfold below. James Mackenzie had been riding the boundary between his ranch and the Whitfield property when he noticed the woman running, and curiosity had drawn him to investigate. He was 26 years old, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar of his shirt and eyes the color of storm clouds that had seen both the beauty and harshness of frontier life. He had inherited his spread from his father 2 years earlier, and while his ranch was larger and more prosperous than the Whitfield place, he had always admired the determination of the family who worked the land next to his. James had seen Clara before, of course, at church socials and in town when she came to buy supplies, but they had never exchanged more than polite greetings. She was 22 years old and had a reputation for being independent and capable, qualities that some men found intimidating, but that James found himself increasingly drawn to as he watched her work with the calf. She had positioned herself beside the newborn and was now trying to coax it to stand, her hands supporting its chest, while she spoke encouragement in a voice too soft for James to hear from his vantage point. The calf made a valiant effort, pushing with its front legs until it was half sitting, but its back legs remained folded beneath it, trembling with the effort. Clara shifted her position, moving behind the animal to support its hindquarters while continuing to talk to it in that same gentle tone. The mother cow had stopped pacing and was watching intently, occasionally letting out a low moo that seemed to be her own form of encouragement. James found himself holding his breath as the calf tried again, its small hooves scrabbling for purchase on the grass. This time, with Clara's help, the calf managed to get all 4 legs beneath it and rose in a wobbly, uncertain stance that lasted perhaps 3 seconds before it collapsed again. But Clara was smiling, James could see, because those 3 seconds meant the calf had the strength it needed. It was just a matter of practice now, of building the muscles and coordination that would allow it to walk and eventually run across the pasture with the rest of the herd. She let the calf rest for a moment, stroking its neck and checking on the mother, who had moved closer and was beginning to lick her baby with long, rough strokes of her tongue. James watched as Clara repeated the process again and again, never showing impatience or frustration, even when the calf fell multiple times. She adjusted her approach with each attempt, learning what worked and what did not. And gradually the calf began to stand for longer periods. 5 seconds became 10, then 15, and finally the little creature was standing on its own, swaying like a drunkard but upright and searching for its mother's milk. Clara stepped back slowly, giving the pair space to bond, and James saw the expression of pure joy that lit up her face as the calf took its first stumbling steps toward the heifer and began to nurse. It was in that moment, watching her brush the dirt and grass from her skirt with hands that were gentle despite their obvious strength, that James Mackenzie felt something shift in his chest. He had known plenty of women in his life, had even courted a girl back in Missouri before his family moved west. But he had never seen anything that affected him quite like the sight of Clara Whitfield helping that calf find its legs. There was something in her patience, in the tenderness she showed to a creature that was not even her own child, that made him think she would be a good mother someday. The thought came unbidden and surprised him with its intensity, because he was not a man given to romantic notions or flights of fancy. Clara stood in the pasture for several more minutes, watching to make sure the calf was nursing properly and that the mother had accepted her baby. Only when she was satisfied that all was well did she turn to head back toward the ranch house, and it was then that she noticed the rider on the ridge. Even from a distance, she recognized James Mackenzie by the distinctive buckskin horse he always rode and by the broad shoulders that were outlined against the bright morning sky. She raised one hand in a wave, a gesture that was neighborly and nothing more, but she felt a flutter of embarrassment at the thought that he might have been watching her the whole time. James returned the wave and then turned his horse away from the ridge, knowing he had work of his own to attend to, and that he had already spent too long observing his neighbor. But as he rode back toward his ranch, he could not shake the image of Clara kneeling in the grass, her hands supporting the calf with such care and determination. He found himself wondering about her, about what her life was like on that small ranch she ran with her younger brother, about whether she ever thought of him the way he was suddenly thinking of her. The Whitfield ranch was not much to look at by most standards. The house was a simple structure of weathered wood with a front porch that sagged slightly on one side, and the barn needed new shingles on the roof. But Clara and her brother Thomas, who was 19 and eager but still learning the ranching business, worked hard to keep the place running despite the challenges. Their mother had died giving birth to Thomas, and their father had raised them both with a firm hand and a loving heart until his death 3 years ago. Clara had been just 19 then, too young by most people's reckoning to take on the responsibility of a ranch, but she had proven herself capable time and again. She walked back to the house now, her mind on the dozens of tasks that needed completing before nightfall. There was a fence that needed mending in the north pasture, chickens to feed, bread to bake, and accounts to review because the bank was making noises about the mortgage payment that was coming due in 2 months. Money was always tight, especially in the spring when they had more expenses than income. But Clara was determined not to lose the land her father had loved so much. She would find a way to make the payment, even if it meant selling some of their cattle before she had planned to. Thomas was in the barn when she returned, mucking out the stalls with the kind of distracted effort that told Clara his mind was elsewhere. He looked up when she entered, his face flushed from exertion, and his sandy hair sticking up in all directions. He was a good boy, Clara thought, though she supposed she should stop thinking of him as a boy, now that he was nearly grown. He had their father's height and their mother's blue eyes, and lately he had been talking about courting Sarah Mitchell, the daughter of the family who owned the general store in town. "The heifer had her calf," Clara announced, reaching for a pitchfork to help with the work. "A little bull, small but healthy. He was having trouble standing, but he is nursing now." Thomas grinned, the expression transforming his serious face into something more boyish. "That makes 23 head now, not counting the calves from the other cows. We are going to have a good year, Clara. I can feel it." She wanted to share his optimism, but the worry about the mortgage payment weighed heavily on her mind. Still, she smiled for his sake and agreed that they were indeed blessed to have such a fine herd. They worked together in companionable silence for a while, the kind of easy partnership that came from years of sharing labor and responsibility. When the stalls were clean and fresh hay had been spread, they moved on to the other chores, dividing the work according to their strengths and preferences. It was not until evening, when they sat down to a simple supper of beans and cornbread, that Thomas mentioned he had seen James Mackenzie riding the boundary that morning. Clara felt that same flutter of embarrassment again, and busied herself with buttering a piece of cornbread, so she would not have to meet her brother's eyes. Thomas, however, was not finished talking about their neighbor. "He has been asking about you in town," Thomas said casually, as if commenting on the weather. "Sarah told me that her father mentioned Mr. Mackenzie came into the store last week and inquired whether you might be attending the spring social next month." Clara looked up sharply, her heart beating a little faster, despite her best efforts to remain calm. "Why would he be asking about me?" Thomas shrugged, but there was a knowing smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Maybe because you are a handsome woman, and he is an unmarried man with a successful ranch. Seems pretty obvious to me." "Do not be ridiculous," Clara said firmly, though she could feel heat rising in her cheeks. James Mackenzie could have his pick of any woman in the territory. He is not interested in a rancher's daughter who spends her days covered in dirt and smelling like cattle. "I think you underestimate yourself," Thomas replied, his voice more serious now. "And you underestimate him too. If you think he is the kind of man who cares more about fancy dresses than about character and capability. Besides, I have seen the way he looks at you after church." Clara wanted to protest further, but something in her brother's words resonated with a hope she had barely allowed herself to acknowledge. She had noticed James Mackenzie too, had felt the pull of attraction when their eyes met across the churchyard, or when he tipped his hat to her in town. But she had convinced herself that a man like him, with his prosperous ranch and his good looks and his easy confidence, would never be interested in someone like her. She was too plain, too practical, too busy trying to keep her family's ranch afloat to think about romance. But that night, as she lay in her narrow bed listening to the coyotes howl in the distance, Clara allowed herself to think about what it might be like if Thomas was right. She imagined James Mackenzie riding up to her door, asking permission to court her, taking her to the spring social where they would dance while the fiddles played. The images were so vivid and so appealing that she had trouble falling asleep, and when she finally did drift off, her dreams were filled with storm-gray eyes and a smile that made her heart race. James Mackenzie was having similar thoughts as he sat on his own porch that night, smoking a pipe and watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. He could not stop thinking about Clara Whitfield, about the way she had looked so completely absorbed in helping that calf, about the strength in her hands and the gentleness in her voice. He had known for some time that he needed to find a wife, that a ranch like his required a partner to help manage it, and to build a family that would carry on after he was gone. But he had been waiting for the right woman, someone who understood the demands of ranch life and who could stand beside him as an equal, rather than someone who needed to be sheltered and protected from every hardship. In Clara, he thought he might have found exactly what he had been looking for, but approaching her was complicated by the difference in their circumstances. His ranch was successful, with a large herd and a bunkhouse full of hired hands to help with the work, while her ranch was small and struggling. He did not want her to think he was offering charity, or that he saw her as someone in need of rescue. What he wanted was to know her as a person, to spend time in her company, and discover whether the attraction he felt was based on something real and lasting. The spring social that Thomas had mentioned seemed like the perfect opportunity. It was a neutral setting where he could approach Clara without the awkwardness of showing up at her ranch unannounced, and there would be dancing and food and enough activity to ease any uncomfortable silences. James decided then and there that he would attend the social and that he would ask Clara to dance, and if she agreed, he would find the courage to express his interest in courting her properly. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity for both of them. Clara threw herself into the work of the ranch with renewed energy, determined to have everything in perfect order before the social. She and Thomas repaired the sagging porch, painted the fence around the vegetable garden, and spent long days riding the range to check on the cattle and make sure none had wandered off or fallen prey to predators. The little bull calf that Clara had helped grew stronger every day, and she felt a special affection for the creature who now came running whenever he saw her, his tail switching happily as he butted his head against her legs in search of attention. James, meanwhile, found excuses to ride along the boundary between their properties more often than was strictly necessary. He told himself he was checking the fence line or looking for strays, but the truth was he hoped to catch another glimpse of Clara at work. Sometimes he did see her in the distance, riding her gray mare, or mending a fence, or simply standing on a rise looking out over the land, and each time he felt that same pull of attraction mixed with something deeper and more substantial. 3 weeks before the social, fate intervened to bring them together in a way neither could have anticipated. A late spring storm rolled across the territory, bringing heavy rain and hail that sent the cattle running for shelter and turned the creeks into raging torrents. Clara and Thomas worked frantically to secure everything that could blow away and to move the herd to higher ground. But in the chaos, 3 of their cows broke through a weak section of fence and disappeared into the storm. When the weather cleared the next morning, Clara saddled her mare and set out to find the missing cattle, leaving Thomas behind to assess the damage to their property. She followed their tracks east, toward the boundary with the Mackenzie ranch, and had been riding for about an hour when she spotted the cows grazing peacefully in a meadow that she was fairly certain belonged to her neighbor. She was trying to figure out the best way to herd them back when James himself appeared, riding his buckskin with two of his ranch hands trailing behind. "Morning, Miss Whitfield," he called out, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. "I believe these ladies belong to you." Clara felt her cheeks warm with a mixture of embarrassment and gratitude. "I apologize for the trespass, Mr. Mackenzie. A section of our fence gave way in the storm, and they got through before we could stop them." James dismounted and walked toward her, his movements easy and confident. Up close, she could see that his eyes were even more striking than she remembered, and there were small lines at the corners that suggested he smiled often. "No harm done. My men and I were just about to drive them back your way, though I confess I was hoping I might run into you in the process." The admission was so unexpected and so forthright that Clara found herself momentarily speechless. She was acutely aware of how she must look after a night of working in the storm, her hair tangled and her clothes still damp. But James was looking at her as if she were the most interesting thing he had seen all day. "You were hoping to see me," she managed finally, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. "I was," James confirmed, and now he was smiling in a way that made her heart do peculiar things in her chest. "I have been trying to work up the courage to ride over to your place and ask if you might allow me to escort you to the spring social. But every time I thought about it, I convinced myself you would say no, so I kept putting it off." Clara stared at him, trying to process what she was hearing. James Mackenzie, who could have his pick of any unmarried woman in the territory, was nervous about asking her to a dance. The idea was so absurd and so wonderful that she almost laughed, but she held it back because she did not want him to think she was mocking him. "Why would you think I would say no?" she asked instead. James reached up to adjust his hat, a gesture that struck her as endearingly uncertain for a man who usually seems so self-assured. "Because you are always so busy with your ranch, and I thought you might see me as an unwelcome distraction. Or worse, you might think I was one of those men who cannot abide a woman who is independent and capable. I want you to know that is not the case. What I saw a few weeks ago, when you were helping that calf stand, it made me realize you are exactly the kind of woman I have been hoping to find." The words hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable in a way that made Clara's defenses crumble. She had spent so long being strong, being the one who held everything together after her father died, that she had forgotten what it felt like to have someone see her, not just as a rancher or a provider, but as a woman worthy of admiration and affection. "You were watching that day," she said softly. "I was," James admitted, "and I have not been able to stop thinking about you since. So, what do you say, Clara? May I call you Clara? Would you do me the honor of letting me escort you to the social?" She wanted to say yes immediately, but years of caution and responsibility made her hesitate. "My ranch is not like yours, James. I do not have fancy dresses or time for elaborate courtship rituals. My life is hard work from sunup to sundown, and I cannot afford to waste time on something that might not lead anywhere." James took a step closer, close enough that she could see the sincerity in his eyes and the set of his jaw that told her he was determined. "I am not asking you to waste time. I am asking you to give me a chance to prove that what I feel is real. One dance, Clara. Just give me one dance. And if at the end of it you decide you are not interested, I will respect that and leave you alone. But I think you might be surprised at what could happen if you let yourself take a chance." Clara looked at him for a long moment, weighing her fears against the hope that was blooming in her chest like the wildflowers that covered the prairie in spring. She thought about the mortgage payment hanging over her head, about all the practical reasons why she should focus on saving her ranch rather than on romance. But she also thought about the loneliness she felt on quiet evenings, about the dream of someday having a partner to share the burdens and joys of life. And she thought about the way James was looking at her now, as if she were someone precious and worth fighting for. "One dance," she agreed finally, and the smile that broke across James's face was like sunrise after a long night. "But I meant what I said about not having fancy dresses." "Wear whatever you like," James said, his voice warm with relief and happiness. "You could show up in your work clothes, and I would still think you were the most beautiful woman there." They arranged the details quickly, with James offering to pick her up in his wagon, so she would not have to ride to town alone. And then he and his men helped her drive the 3 cows back to her property and spent an hour helping to repair the damaged fence. Clara watched him work alongside his hired hands, noting the way he treated them with respect and good humor, and she felt her initial attraction deepening into something more substantial. Here was a man who did not think himself above manual labor despite his success, who kept his word and went out of his way to help a neighbor in need. When the fence was repaired and James was preparing to leave, he paused beside his horse and looked back at Clara with an expression that made her breath catch. "I meant what I said earlier. I think you would be a good mother. I saw it in the way you cared for that calf, but I see it in everything you do. The way you look after your brother, the way you tend your land and your animals. You have a gift for nurturing things and helping them grow, and that is a rare and valuable quality." Clara felt tears prick at her eyes, though she could not have said exactly why. Maybe it was because no one had spoken to her that way since her father died, or maybe it was because James had seen something in her that she had never fully acknowledged in herself. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That means more to me than you know." James tipped his hat one more time and then mounted his horse, but before he rode away he turned back with a grin that was almost boyish in its enthusiasm. "I will see you at the social, Clara Whitfield, and I am going to dance with you until your feet are sore and you are laughing so hard you cannot breathe." She watched him ride away, his figure gradually disappearing into the distance, and only when he was completely out of sight did she allow herself to smile with the full force of the joy that was bubbling up inside her. Thomas was going to tease her mercilessly when she told him what had happened, but she did not care. For the first time in years, she had something to look forward to beyond the endless cycle of work and worry, and the anticipation was as intoxicating as whiskey and far more pleasant. The days leading up to the social seemed to crawl by at an agonizing pace. Clara threw herself into her work as always, but now there was a lightness to her step, and a tendency to break into humming while she went about her chores. Thomas noticed immediately and made good on his promise to tease her, but his ribbing was good-natured and clearly came from a place of happiness for his sister. He had been worried about her, Clara realized, worried that she was sacrificing too much of her own life to keep their ranch running and to look after him. "You should wear Mother's blue dress," Thomas suggested one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "The one she wore to her wedding. It is still in the trunk in the attic, and I think it would fit you." Clara had forgotten about the dress, which their father had carefully preserved, along with a few other treasured possessions after their mother's death. The idea of wearing it to the social felt right somehow, like having her mother's blessing for this new chapter in her life. She retrieved the trunk the next day and found the dress wrapped in clean muslin, the fabric still vibrant despite the years. It was a beautiful shade of blue that reminded Clara of the sky on a clear autumn day, with delicate buttons down the front and sleeves that would fall just past her elbows. She tried it on in her room, standing before the small mirror and hardly recognizing the woman who looked back at her. The dress fit perfectly, hugging her waist and falling in soft folds to her ankles, and when she pinned up her hair and added the simple silver earrings that had also belonged to her mother, the transformation was complete. She looked like a lady, she thought with wonder, not just a rancher's daughter who spent her days in practical work clothes. The realization brought a lump to her throat because it reminded her that she was both things, that she could be strong and capable and still allow herself to be feminine and hopeful about romance. On the day of the social, Clara woke with butterflies in her stomach and a sense of nervous anticipation that made it hard to focus on even simple tasks. She and Thomas completed the morning chores together, and then she retreated to her room to prepare for the evening. She bathed carefully in the big tin tub they kept in the kitchen, washing away the dust and grime of ranch life, and then took her time with her hair, braiding and pinning it into a style that was simple but elegant. The blue dress went on last, and when she finally emerged from her room, Thomas let out a low whistle of appreciation. "James Mackenzie is going to fall over his own feet when he sees you," her brother declared, and Clara felt a rush of affection for him, mixed with gratitude that he was so supportive of her budding romance. James arrived precisely on time, driving a wagon that was clean and well-maintained, with 2 sturdy horses in the harness. He had clearly made an effort with his own appearance, wearing dark trousers and a white shirt with a string tie, and his hair was neatly combed back from his face. But it was the expression in his eyes when he saw Clara that made her feel like the most beautiful woman in the world. He stared at her for a long moment, his lips parting slightly in surprise, and then he broke into a smile that was so full of admiration and delight that Clara felt her nervousness begin to fade. "You look stunning," James said as he helped her up into the wagon, his hand warm and steady around hers. Though, I have to admit, I meant what I said about thinking you were beautiful in your work clothes, too. Clara laughed, the sound coming out more easily than she had expected. Well, I thought I should make an effort for such an important occasion. Thomas helped me find this dress. It was my mother's. Something shifted in James's expression, a deepening of the respect and affection that was already there. She had excellent taste, and I am honored that you chose to wear it tonight. The ride to town took nearly an hour, and they spent the time talking about everything and nothing. James told her about his ranch, about the challenges of managing a large operation, and his plans for expanding the herd in the coming years. Clara shared her own struggles and triumphs, and she was grateful that James listened with genuine interest rather than offering unsolicited advice or making her feel inadequate for the difficulties she faced. There was an ease to their conversation that surprised her, as if they had known each other for years rather than just a few weeks. And by the time they arrived at the town hall where the social was being held, Clara felt as if she were floating on air. The hall was already crowded with people when they entered, the air filled with the sound of fiddles tuning and the buzz of conversation as neighbors caught up on news and gossip. Clara saw several familiar faces, including Sarah Mitchell, who gave her an encouraging smile and a subtle thumbs up when she noticed Clara was with James. There were also a few raised eyebrows and speculative looks, because everyone in town knew about the difference in circumstances between the Mackenzie and Whitfield ranches. But Clara decided she did not care what anyone else thought. Tonight was about her and James, about exploring the connection they had discovered and seeing where it might lead. James stayed close to her side as they made their way through the crowd, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. He introduced her to several people she had not met before, including a banker from the territorial capital who was visiting relatives, and he spoke of her with such pride and respect that Clara felt her heart swell with emotion. When the music finally started and couples began moving on to the dance floor, James turned to her with an expression of mock seriousness. "I believe I was promised a dance," he said, offering his hand with an exaggerated bow that made her giggle. "And I intend to collect." Clara took his hand and let him lead her onto the floor, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and nervousness because she had not danced in years and was not sure she remembered how. But James was a skilled partner, guiding her through the steps with patience and grace, and within moments she had relaxed into the rhythm of the music. They danced one song, and then another, and then several more after that, pausing only occasionally to catch their breath or grab a cup of punch from the refreshment table. It was during one of these brief breaks that Clara found herself approached by an older woman she recognized as Mrs. Henderson, one of the town's most notorious gossips. The woman's eyes were sharp with curiosity as she looked between Clara and James, and her smile had an edge that put Clara immediately on guard. "Well, well, Mrs. Henderson said, in a voice that carried farther than was strictly necessary. "I must say I was surprised to see you here with Mr. Mackenzie, Miss Whitfield. Such a successful man usually has his pick of the more established families in the area. I suppose you must have quite the dowry to catch his attention." The words were designed to wound, to make Clara feel small and inadequate, and for a moment she felt her old insecurities rising up to choke her. But before she could formulate a response, James stepped forward with a smile that did not reach his eyes, and a tone that was polite but unmistakably cold. "I think you misunderstand the situation, Mrs. Henderson," he said clearly. "I am the one who is honored that Miss Whitfield agreed to attend the social with me. She is one of the most capable and admirable women I have ever met, and her worth has nothing to do with dowries or family connections. In fact, I would say that any man who chooses a wife based on such superficial considerations is a fool who does not deserve the happiness of a true partnership." Mrs. Henderson's face turned an unflattering shade of red, and she sputtered for a moment before turning on her heel and marching away. Clara stared after her in shock, and then she looked up at James with gratitude and something deeper warming in her chest. He had defended her publicly and without hesitation, making his regard for her clear to everyone within earshot, and the gesture meant more to her than any pretty words or expensive gifts could have. "Thank you," she said softly, squeezing his hand. "You did not have to do that." "Yes, I did," James replied firmly. "I will not stand by and let anyone disrespect you, Clara. Not now, not ever. You deserve to be treated with honor and consideration, and I intend to make sure that happens for as long as you will let me." They danced until Clara's feet truly were sore, just as James had promised, and she was laughing so hard at one of his stories that she could barely catch her breath. The evening flew by in a blur of music and conversation, and stolen moments when James would lean close to whisper something in her ear that made her heart race. By the time they left the hall to begin the long drive back to her ranch, Clara felt as if she were living in a dream, one that she never wanted to end. The night air was cool and filled with the scent of sage and wildflowers as James drove the wagon slowly along the rutted road. Above them, the stars were so bright and numerous that they seemed to form a glowing canopy, and Clara found herself leaning against James's shoulder without quite meaning to. He did not pull away, but instead shifted slightly to make her more comfortable, and they rode in silence for a while, content to simply be near each other. "I had a wonderful time tonight," Clara said eventually, her voice soft in the darkness. "Thank you for asking me and for making me feel so special." "You are special," James said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "And I hope you will give me the opportunity to keep showing you that. I know we have only just started getting to know each other, but I want you to know that my intentions are serious, Clara. I am not looking for a casual flirtation or a way to pass the time. I am looking for a partner, someone to build a life with, and I think that someone might be you." The declaration should have frightened her, should have sent her running in the opposite direction because it was too much too soon. But instead, Clara felt a sense of rightness settle over her, as if all the pieces of her life were finally clicking into place. "I think it might be me too," she admitted. "But there are things you need to know about my situation, James. My ranch is in trouble. We owe money to the bank, and if we cannot make the payment in 6 weeks, we might lose everything my father worked so hard to build. I do not want you to think I am interested in you because of your success or because I need rescuing. That is not what this is about." James brought the wagon to a stop and turned to face her fully, his expression serious in the moonlight. "I appreciate your honesty, and I believe you when you say that is not why you are interested in me. But I want you to know that if we move forward with this courtship, your problems become my problems too. Not because I think you are weak or incapable, but because that is what partners do. They support each other and face challenges together. So, if you are worried about the mortgage, we can figure that out. Maybe I can loan you the money, or maybe we can find another solution. But I do not want you carrying that burden alone anymore." Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks before she could stop them, and she wiped them away with the back of her hand, laughing a little at her own emotional response. "I am not used to having someone offer to help," she confessed. "It has been just me and Thomas for so long, trying to hold everything together, and sometimes it feels like I am drowning under the weight of all the responsibility." "You do not have to drown anymore," James said gently, reaching up to brush away a tear she had missed. "Let me help you, Clara. Let me be the person you lean on when things get hard. I promise I will never make you feel weak or dependent. This is about partnership, about two people who are stronger together than they are apart." Clara looked into his eyes and saw nothing but sincerity and determination, and she felt the last of her resistance crumble away. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, yes. I want to try this, James. I want to see where it leads." He smiled then, a slow, beautiful smile that made her forget all about her worries and fears. And then he leaned forward and kissed her softly, his lips warm and gentle against hers. It was her first kiss, though she would have been embarrassed to admit that to him, and it was everything she had imagined and more. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing a little harder, and Clara could see the same wonder and desire reflected in James's eyes that she felt coursing through her own veins. "I should get you home," James said reluctantly, his voice rougher than it had been a moment before. "It is late, and I do not want Thomas to worry." They drove the rest of the way in comfortable silence, their hands clasped together on the seat between them, and when they arrived at the Whitfield ranch, James walked Clara to her door like a proper gentleman. He kissed her once more, lingering a little longer this time, and then he forced himself to step back before things could progress further. "I will come by tomorrow afternoon if that is all right with you," he said. "I want to talk to you and Thomas about the mortgage situation and see what we can figure out together." "That would be wonderful," Clara agreed, already looking forward to seeing him again, even though they had just said goodnight. "Sleep well, James." "You too, Clara." She watched from the porch as he drove away, not going inside until the wagon had disappeared from view, and the sound of the horses' hooves had faded into silence. When she finally entered the house, she found Thomas waiting up for her, sitting at the kitchen table with a knowing grin on his face. "So," her brother said, drawing out the word, "how was the social?" Clara could not help the smile that spread across her face, could not contain the happiness that was bubbling up inside her, like a spring after winter's thaw. "It was perfect," she said simply. "Absolutely perfect." True to his word, James arrived the next afternoon, driving his wagon with several large bags of flour and sugar in the back. He explained that he had been planning to place a supply order anyway, and had picked up extra for them. But Clara suspected he had done it specifically to help them save money. She wanted to be proud and refuse the gift, but she remembered what James had said about partnership and accepting help. So she thanked him graciously and invited him inside for coffee and the apple pie she had baked that morning. The three of them sat around the kitchen table, and Clara laid out the full extent of their financial situation without trying to hide anything or make it seem better than it was. The mortgage payment was $200, due in 6 weeks, and they currently had $83 saved. They were expecting to sell some cattle in a month, which would bring in additional funds, but probably not enough to cover the full amount. Thomas had been taking on odd jobs in town when he could spare time from the ranch, and Clara had been selling eggs and butter to neighbors, but it was a slow process and time was running out. James listened carefully, asking questions and making notes on a piece of paper he had brought with him. When Clara finished explaining, he sat back and studied the numbers for a long moment, his brow furrowed in concentration. Then he looked up with an expression that was thoughtful but optimistic. "Here is what I propose," he said. "I will loan you the full $200 to make the mortgage payment. But instead of charging you interest the way the bank would, we will work out a repayment plan based on what you can reasonably afford each month. You can pay me back in installments over the next year or two, and there will be no penalty if you need to skip a payment occasionally because of circumstances beyond your control. In exchange, you let me help you make some improvements to your ranch that will increase its productivity and profitability in the long term." Clara felt her throat tighten with emotion, and she had to blink hard to keep from crying again. "That is incredibly generous, James. But I do not want you to think you have to save us. We will find a way to manage." "I know you would," James said gently. "But why should you struggle alone when there is a better option? This is not charity, Clara. Think of it as an investment in our future together, because if things work out the way I hope they will, your ranch and mine will be joined someday anyway." Thomas cleared his throat, drawing their attention. "I think what James is offering makes a lot of sense, Clara, and I think you should accept. We have been working ourselves to the bone trying to keep up, and maybe it is time to admit we could use some help. There is no shame in that." Clara looked between her brother and the man she was growing to care for more deeply with each passing day, and she realized they were both right. She had been so focused on proving she could handle everything alone that she had forgotten the value of accepting support from people who cared about her. "All right," she said finally, "I accept your offer, James, with gratitude and with the promise that we will pay back every penny." "I have no doubt about that," James said with a smile. "Now, let us talk about those improvements." Over the next several hours, they discussed ways to make the Whitfield ranch more efficient and profitable. James suggested building a better irrigation system to ensure the pastures stayed green, even during dry spells, and he offered to lend some of his men to help with the construction. He also recommended purchasing a breeding bull of superior quality, which would improve the genetics of their herd and allow them to command higher prices when they sold cattle. Thomas was enthusiastic about all the ideas, and even Clara had to admit that James's experience and resources could make a real difference in their operation. By the time James left that evening, they had a solid plan in place, and Clara felt as if a massive weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She walked out to the wagon with him, and before he climbed up to the driver's seat, he pulled her into a brief embrace that left her feeling warm and protected. "We are going to make this work," James said confidently. "The ranch, the courtship, all of it. You will see." "I believe you," Clara replied, and she realized with some surprise that she truly did. The weeks that followed were some of the happiest Clara could remember. James was a frequent visitor to the ranch, sometimes arriving early in the morning to help with chores before heading back to his own place. Other times, showing up in the evening with food or supplies, or simply the desire to spend time in her company. He and Thomas worked together on the irrigation project, digging trenches and laying pipe with the help of James's hired men, and the transformation in the pastures was remarkable. Grass that had been sparse and struggling became lush and green, and the cattle grew fat and healthy, grazing on the improved land. Clara found herself falling more deeply in love with James with each passing day. It was not just his willingness to help or his obvious affection for her, though those things certainly mattered. It was also the little things, like the way he always removed his hat when he came inside her house, or how he listened carefully when she talked about her dreams and fears, or the patience he showed when teaching Thomas new ranching techniques. He was kind to everyone he encountered, from the ranch hands who worked for him to the shopkeepers in town, and Clara saw in him the kind of man her father would have approved of and respected. Their courtship progressed slowly but steadily, with stolen kisses in the barn and long conversations on the porch after Thomas had gone to bed. James was always respectful of her reputation and her wishes, never pushing for more than she was ready to give, but Clara could sense the desire that simmered beneath his careful control. She felt it too, a growing hunger to be closer to him in every way. But she was also grateful for his patience because it allowed their emotional connection to deepen before physical intimacy complicated things. 6 weeks after the spring social, Clara made the mortgage payment to the bank using the money James had loaned her, and the sense of relief was so profound that she actually cried when the bank officer handed her the receipt. Thomas was with her, and he put his arm around her shoulders in a gesture of brotherly comfort and support. They walked out of the bank together, heads held high, knowing that their father's legacy was safe for at least another year. That evening, James came to the ranch for supper, and Clara cooked a special meal to celebrate. They ate roast chicken with potatoes and carrots, followed by a chocolate cake that had taken her half the afternoon to prepare, and the conversation flowed easily as they discussed plans for the rest of the summer. When the meal was finished and the dishes had been washed, Thomas excused himself with a meaningful look at his sister, leaving Clara and James alone in the parlor. They sat together on the old sofa that had belonged to Clara's parents, their bodies close but not quite touching, and James took her hand in his with a seriousness that made her heart begin to race. "There is something I have been wanting to talk to you about," he began, his voice low and intense. "Something important." Clara felt a flutter of nervous anticipation in her stomach, but she kept her voice steady when she replied. "What is it?" James took a deep breath, as if gathering courage, and then he looked directly into her eyes with an expression that was both vulnerable and determined. "I know we have only been courting for a couple of months, and by some standards that might seem too fast. But I have never been more certain of anything in my life than I am of this. I love you, Clara Whitfield. I love your strength and your compassion and the way you face every challenge with courage and grace. I love the way you care for your animals and your brother and your land, and I want to spend the rest of my life showing you how much you mean to me." Clara's breath caught in her throat, and she felt tears beginning to form in her eyes, even though she was smiling. "I love you too, James," she whispered, the words feeling both monumental and perfectly natural. "I think I started falling in love with you that day you watched me help the calf, even though I did not realize it at the time." James's face broke into a grin of pure joy, and he reached into his pocket to pull out a small velvet box. "Then I have one more thing to ask you," he said, opening the box to reveal a simple gold ring with a small but beautiful diamond. "Clara Whitfield, will you marry me? Will you be my wife and my partner and the mother of the children I hope we will have someday?" The mention of children made Clara think of that morning weeks ago, when James had watched her with the calf and thought she would be a good mother. The memory was precious to her, a reminder of how far they had come and how much they had already shared. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and certain despite the tears now streaming down her face. "Yes, James, I will marry you. There is nothing I want more." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and then he pulled her into his arms and kissed her with a passion that took her breath away. They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's embrace, letting the reality of their engagement sink in and savoring the joy of knowing they had found in each other the partner they had both been seeking. When they finally pulled apart, James rested his forehead against hers and laughed softly. "I cannot wait to marry you," he said, "but I suppose we should probably wait at least a few months to plan a proper wedding and give people time to adjust to the idea." "The end of summer," Clara suggested. "August maybe, when the weather is still warm, but before the busy fall season starts. That gives us 3 months to prepare." which should be enough time. August sounds perfect, James agreed. And in the meantime, we can start making plans for combining our ranches and figuring out where we will live. My house is bigger, but if you would prefer to stay here because of the memories, I am willing to make that work. Clara thought about it for a moment, considering the practical aspects as well as the emotional ones. I think your house makes more sense, she said finally. It is larger and in better condition, and it would be easier to manage the combined operation from there. But I would like to keep this house in good repair too, maybe use it for hired help, or rent it out to generate additional income. And I want to bring some of my parents' things with us so we can have them as reminders of where we came from. Whatever you want, James promised. This is a partnership, remember? We make these decisions together. They spent the rest of the evening discussing their plans and dreaming about their future. And when James finally left, close to midnight, Clara felt as if she were walking on air. She lay in bed that night, staring at the ring on her finger, watching the way it caught the moonlight streaming through her window, and she sent up a silent prayer of thanks to whatever force had brought James Mackenzie into her life. The next few months passed in a whirlwind of activity and preparation. Clara and James announced their engagement at church the following Sunday, and while there were a few raised eyebrows and whispered comments from people like Mrs. Henderson, the overall response was warm and congratulatory. Sarah Mitchell squealed with delight and immediately began planning a bridal shower, and even the usually reserved banker who held the mortgage on the Whitfield ranch offered his best wishes. Clara threw herself into wedding preparations while still managing the daily demands of the ranch. She sewed her own wedding dress, a simple but elegant creation of white cotton with lace trim that she worked on in the evenings by lamplight. James built them a new bed frame as a wedding gift, carving intricate designs into the headboard that depicted scenes from ranch life, including a small calf learning to stand. The gesture touched Clara deeply, a reminder that he remembered and treasured that moment as much as she did. As summer progressed, the two ranches began functioning more and more as a single unit. James's hired hands helped with the work at the Whitfield place, and Thomas spent time at the Mackenzie ranch learning from James's foreman. Clara visited James's house frequently, getting familiar with the space and making mental notes about small changes she wanted to implement once they were married. The house was indeed larger than hers, with a proper dining room and a parlor with a fireplace, and there was a guest room that Clara immediately began envisioning as a nursery. The wedding took place on a Saturday afternoon, in late August, held at the small church where Clara and her family had worshipped for years. The building was packed with friends and neighbors, and even some of James's relatives had traveled from other parts of the territory to attend. Clara walked down the aisle on Thomas's arm, her brother looking proud and a little emotional as he prepared to give her away. James waited at the altar, looking impossibly handsome in a new suit, and the expression on his face when he saw her approaching in her wedding dress made Clara's heart swell with love. The ceremony was simple but moving, with traditional vows that Clara and James spoke with voices that rang clear and true through the church. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and James kissed her in front of everyone they knew, Clara felt as if her life was truly beginning. They walked back down the aisle together as the congregation cheered, and outside in the warm sunshine, they climbed into a wagon that had been decorated with ribbons and wildflowers for the ride to the reception. The celebration was held at James's ranch, which was now Clara's ranch too, and featured a feast that had taken days to prepare. There was roasted beef and chicken, fresh vegetables from Clara's garden, bread and pies and cakes contributed by various neighbors, and dancing that lasted well into the night. James and Clara had their first dance as husband and wife to a fiddle tune that was sweet and romantic, and Clara felt as if she were floating in his arms as they moved together across the makeshift dance floor that had been set up in front of the barn. Late in the evening, when most of the guests had departed and only close friends and family remained, James whisked Clara away to the house they would now share. He carried her over the threshold in the traditional manner, both of them laughing at the romance of the gesture, and then he set her down gently in the bedroom that was now theirs. The room was lit by candles that someone, probably one of James's ranch hands, had arranged earlier, and the new bed frame gleamed in the flickering light. "Are you nervous?" James asked softly, cupping her face in his hands and looking at her with tenderness and desire. "A little," Clara admitted, because she had never been with a man before and was uncertain about what to expect. "But I trust you, James. I know you will be gentle with me." "Always," he promised, and then he kissed her slowly, taking his time as he helped her out of her wedding dress and showed her the depths of physical love that she had only imagined before. He was indeed gentle, patient, and attentive to her needs, and by the time they fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms in the early hours of the morning, Clara felt as if they had truly become one person, bound together by love and commitment and the profound intimacy they had just shared. Their first year of marriage was everything Clara had hoped for and more. She and James fell into an easy partnership, dividing the work of running their combined ranches according to their strengths and interests. Clara took charge of the accounts and the garden and the smaller livestock like chickens and pigs, while James managed the cattle operation and the hired hands. But they made all major decisions together, discussing challenges and opportunities over breakfast or during quiet evenings on the porch, and Clara never felt that her opinions were less valued than her husband's. Thomas continued to live in the original Whitfield house, which they had indeed decided to keep as housing for their foreman, when Thomas eventually moved on to start his own life. Her brother had become engaged to Sarah Mitchell just before Christmas, and the two of them were planning a spring wedding. Clara was delighted to see her brother so happy, and she welcomed Sarah into the family with open arms, knowing that her new sister-in-law would be a good influence on Thomas and a good friend to her. The little bull calf that Clara had helped stand on that fateful spring morning grew into a strong and healthy steer, and Clara maintained a special affection for him, even as he joined the rest of the herd. Sometimes when she walked through the pasture, he would come up to her looking for attention, and she would scratch behind his ears and remember the day everything changed. James always smiled when he saw her with the steer, and once he commented that it was fitting that the animal who had brought them together should thrive under their care. In the spring of 1883, Clara discovered she was pregnant. The realization came one morning when she woke feeling queasy and immediately had to run outside to be sick in the bushes. James hovered anxiously while she cleaned herself up, his face a mixture of concern and dawning hope. And when she finally confirmed that, yes, she thought she was carrying their child, his whoop of joy could probably be heard all the way into town. He was impossibly protective during her pregnancy, constantly worrying that she was working too hard, or not eating enough, or pushing herself beyond what was safe. Clara found his concern endearing even when it became a little excessive, and she did her best to reassure him that pregnancy was a natural condition and not an illness. But she also appreciated his care, especially during the difficult weeks in her first trimester, when the morning sickness was relentless and even the smell of coffee made her stomach revolt. As her belly grew and the baby's arrival drew nearer, James and Clara transformed the guest room into a nursery, painting the walls a cheerful yellow and building a crib that matched the intricate design of their bed frame. Clara sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her heart full of wonder at the thought of the new life they had created together. She thought often of James's words that day by the pasture about how she would be a good mother, and she prayed that he was right, that she would have the patience and love and wisdom to raise their child well. Their son was born on a crisp October morning in 1883, after a labor that lasted 12 hours and left Clara exhausted but elated. James was by her side for the entire ordeal, holding her hand and whispering encouragement, even when she shouted at him that this was entirely his fault, and she was never going through this again. The doctor, an older man who had delivered half the babies in the territory, laughed at her declaration and told James that every woman said that during labor, and most of them changed their minds eventually. When their son finally made his appearance, screaming lustily and waving tiny fists in outrage at being forced from his warm cocoon, Clara felt a wave of love so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. James cut the umbilical cord with shaking hands, and when the doctor placed the clean, swaddled baby in Clara's arms, her husband sat beside her on the bed and stared at their child with an expression of awe and fierce protectiveness. "He is perfect," James said hoarsely, tracing one finger down their son's soft cheek. "Absolutely perfect. What should we name him?" Clara had been thinking about names for months, but now that the moment was here, only one felt right. "David," she said softly. "After my father, David Thomas Mackenzie, if you agree." "I agree," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "Your father would be proud of you, Clara, proud of everything you have accomplished and the family we are building together." David was a healthy, happy baby who quickly became the center of their universe. Clara discovered that motherhood came naturally to her, just as James had predicted that day he watched her with the calf. She was patient with David's crying and gentle with his fragile new body, and she found joy in even the most mundane aspects of caring for him. James was equally devoted, often taking over in the middle of the night so Clara could sleep, and the sight of her strong, capable husband cradling their tiny son never failed to make her heart melt. Thomas and Sarah married the following spring, in a ceremony that was smaller than Clara and James's wedding, but no less meaningful. The young couple moved into a small house on the Mackenzie ranch that James had built specifically for them, close enough to be helpful, but far enough to give them privacy. Sarah was indeed pregnant within a few months, and she and Clara spent many happy hours together, comparing notes on pregnancy and planning for the future, when their children would grow up as cousins and friends. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm over the next few years. The combined Mackenzie-Whitfield ranch prospered beyond Clara's wildest dreams, becoming one of the most successful operations in the territory. They paid off the original mortgage within 2 years of their marriage, and James used the money Clara had been sending him as repayment to establish a savings account for David's future education. Their herd grew larger and healthier, and they were able to hire additional hands to help with the workload, which gave Clara and James more time to spend with their son and each other. In the summer of 1885, Clara became pregnant again, and this time the morning sickness was even worse than it had been with David. James joked that it must be a girl, because everyone knew that carrying daughters made women sicker, and Clara threw a dish towel at him, but secretly hoped he was right. She longed for a daughter to balance out their family, a little girl she could teach to sew and cook and ride as well as any man. Their daughter was born in February of 1886, on a snowy evening when the temperature had dropped below zero and the wind howled around the house like a living thing. The labor was faster than it had been with David, but more intense, and when their daughter finally arrived, Clara was so exhausted she could barely keep her eyes open. But the moment she heard that first angry wail and felt the weight of her newborn daughter placed on her chest, all the pain and fatigue melted away. "You were right," Clara told James with a tired smile. "It was a girl." "I usually am," James replied with a grin, earning himself a weak swat from his wife. "What should we name her?" "Rose," Clara said without hesitation. "Rose Elizabeth Mackenzie, after your mother and mine." James's eyes grew suspiciously bright, and he leaned down to kiss Clara's forehead, and then their daughter's soft, dark hair. "Perfect," he said. "Our perfect little Rose." David, who was now 2 years old, was initially uncertain about the squalling bundle that had invaded his home, but he quickly warmed to his baby sister and became her fierce protector. Clara would often find him sitting beside Rose's cradle, talking to her in a nonsensical babble that seemed to calm her crying, and her heart would swell with love for both her children. The years continued to pass in a blur of happiness and hard work. David and Rose grew from babies into children, and the ranch grew with them, expanding to include more land and more cattle, and a reputation for quality that attracted buyers from across the territory and beyond. Thomas and Sarah had 3 children of their own, 2 boys and a girl, and the cousins were as close as siblings, always getting into mischief and adventures on the vast expanse of the ranch. Clara watched her children grow, with a mixture of joy and bittersweet awareness of how quickly time was passing. David had James's dark hair and serious demeanor, but he had inherited Clara's compassion and her gentle way with animals. Rose was wild and fearless, always climbing trees she should not climb and riding horses that were too spirited for a little girl. But she also had a tender heart and would cry over injured birds or lost kittens. Both children were being raised to understand the value of hard work and the importance of treating others with kindness and respect, lessons that Clara and James modeled every day through their own actions. On a warm spring evening in 1892, 10 years after that fateful day when James had watched Clara help a calf stand on wobbly new legs, the entire family gathered on the porch of the main ranch house for supper. David was now 8 years old, and Rose was 6, and Thomas and Sarah's children ranged in age from 7 down to 2. The table was crowded and noisy, filled with laughter and the pleasant chaos that came with having multiple young children in one place. Clara sat beside James, her hand resting in his under the table, and looked around at the faces of the people she loved most in the world. This was what she had dreamed of during those lonely years after her father died, when she had wondered if she would ever have more than just hard work and responsibility. She had a partner who loved and respected her, children who brought joy to every day, and a family that extended beyond blood to include dear friends and loyal employees who had become like family themselves. "What are you thinking about?" James asked softly, leaning close so only she could hear. "I am thinking about how blessed we are," Clara replied, her voice full of emotion, "and about how grateful I am that you stopped to watch me help that calf all those years ago." James smiled, that same slow, beautiful smile that still made her heart race after a decade of marriage. "I think about that day all the time," he confessed, "about how close I came to just riding past, minding my own business. But something made me stop and watch, and I am so glad I did. Seeing you with that calf, seeing the patience and care you showed, I knew in that moment that you were the woman I had been waiting for, and I was right." "You usually are," Clara said with a laugh, echoing the words he had spoken years ago when Rose was born. They sat together in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the children play and watching the sun sink toward the horizon in a blaze of orange and gold. The land stretched out before them, green and prosperous and beautiful, a testament to everything they had built together through hard work and love and unwavering commitment to each other. In the distance, Clara could see the pasture where that little bull calf had been born, the calf whose wobbly new legs had changed the course of her entire life. The pasture was full now, with cattle bearing the combined Mackenzie Whitfield brand, a symbol of two families and two ranches that had become one through marriage and partnership. The original calf, now a massive steer, grazed peacefully among the herd, and Clara felt a rush of affection for the animal who had inadvertently played such an important role in her love story. David came running up to the porch then, his face flushed with excitement as he tugged on his father's sleeve. "Papa, can we go check on the new foal? Mama said it was born this morning, and I want to make sure it is standing properly." James looked at Clara with a grin, and she could see the memories reflected in his eyes, the echo of that spring morning when everything had changed. "Of course we can," James told his son. "In fact, I think we should all go. It is important to make sure young things get a good start in life." The entire family trooped down to the barn together, children running ahead while the adults followed at a more sedate pace. The foal was indeed standing, albeit on legs that were comically long and unsteady, and its mother stood nearby keeping a watchful eye on her baby. David approached slowly and carefully, just as Clara had taught him, and he reached out a gentle hand to stroke the foal's soft nose. "It is beautiful," David breathed, his eyes shining with wonder. "Do you think it will be a good riding horse when it grows up?" "I think it will be whatever it wants to be," James replied, ruffling his son's hair. "But yes, with proper training and care, it should make an excellent mount." Rose had climbed up onto the fence rail to get a better view, and she was watching the foal with the same intense focus that Clara remembered having at that age. "I want to help take care of it," she announced. "I want to make sure it grows up strong and healthy." "Then you shall," Clara promised her daughter. "We will all help take care of it together." As the family stood together in the barn, watching the new life that had just entered the world, Clara felt a sense of completeness and contentment that went bone deep. This was her legacy, not just the ranch and the land, but the love and partnership she had built with James and the family they were raising together. These children would grow up knowing they were valued and cherished, would learn to treat animals and people with kindness and respect, and would carry forward the values that Clara and James held dear. The years continued to flow by like a river, sometimes rushing fast and sometimes moving slow, but always forward. David grew into a tall, serious young man who took his responsibilities on the ranch seriously and who had a special gift for training horses. Rose remained spirited and adventurous, but she also developed into a skilled rancher who could rope and brand as well as any of the hired hands. Both children made their parents proud in countless ways, and Clara and James watched their growth with the same wonder and satisfaction they had felt, watching that calf take its first steps so many years ago. Thomas and Sarah's family grew as well, adding a fourth child and then a fifth, until their house was bursting at the seams with noise and laughter. The two families remained close, working together and celebrating together and supporting each other through the inevitable challenges that came with ranching and life on the frontier. When Sarah's father died and left her the general store in town, Clara helped her manage the accounts and inventory, bringing the same practical skills she used on the ranch to bear on the new enterprise. The store prospered under their joint management, becoming another source of income and stability for the extended family. In the summer of 1900, when David was 17 and beginning to talk about his future, James and Clara took a rare evening to themselves. They rode out to a rise on the edge of their property, the same spot where James had stopped to watch Clara all those years ago, and they sat together on a blanket watching the sun set over the land they had worked so hard to build and maintain. James's hair was beginning to show threads of silver at the temples now, and Clara could see the fine lines around his eyes that had been etched by years of sun and wind and laughter. But to her, he was as handsome as he had been the day they met. Perhaps even more so, because now she knew every facet of his character and loved him for all of it. "Do you remember the first time I saw you?" James asked, breaking the comfortable silence. "Really saw you. I mean, not just noticed you at church or in passing." "Of course I remember," Clara replied, leaning her head on his shoulder. "You were sitting right here on this rise, watching me help that calf. I was so embarrassed when I realized you had been observing me the whole time." "You should not have been embarrassed," James said, wrapping his arm around her and pulling her closer. "You were magnificent. You are always magnificent. And I was right about you, Clara. You are a wonderful mother. Our children are lucky to have you, and so am I." Tears pricked at Clara's eyes, though they were happy, tears born of gratitude and love. "I am the lucky one," she insisted. "You gave me everything I ever dreamed of and so much more. A partner, a family, a life full of purpose and meaning. I cannot imagine what my life would have been like if you had not stopped that day, if you had not taken a chance on me." "I would have found another way," James said with certainty. "Maybe it would have taken longer. Maybe I would have had to work harder to get your attention. But I would have found a way. Some things are meant to be, Clara. And we were definitely meant to be." They sat together as darkness fell and the stars began to appear overhead, talking about their children and their plans and their hopes for the future. David was considering attending a university back east to study animal husbandry and modern ranching techniques. And while Clara would miss him terribly, she supported his ambitions and knew that what he learned would benefit the ranch when he returned. Rose was showing interest in Sarah's store and had mentioned that she might like to open her own business someday, perhaps a dress shop or a bakery in town. James and Clara were committed to supporting whatever paths their children chose, trusting that they had raised them with the values and skills they would need to succeed in whatever they attempted. When they finally rode back to the house, the windows were glowing with warm lamplight, and they could hear the sound of Rose practicing piano inside. The scene was so peaceful and so perfect that Clara felt her heart might burst with happiness. This was home, she thought. Not just the physical structure, but the feeling of love and security and belonging that permeated every corner of the life they had built together. David married young, falling in love with the daughter of a neighboring rancher when he was just 20 years old. Clara had been worried at first that he was too young for such a serious commitment. But she saw the way he looked at Emily, the tenderness and respect and devotion in his eyes, and she recognized it because it was the same way James had looked at her from the beginning. The wedding was held at the ranch in the summer of 1903, and watching her son exchange vows with the woman he loved, Clara felt as if she were seeing her own story play out again in a new generation. Rose took a little longer to find her match, and for a while Clara worried that her independent, strong-willed daughter might never find a man who could appreciate her fierce spirit. But when Rose was 24 years old, she met a young lawyer from the territorial capital who had come to town to handle a land dispute. Marcus was educated and ambitious, but he was also kind and patient, and he treated Rose with the respect and admiration she deserved. They courted for a year before Marcus proposed, and when they married in 1907, Clara cried through the entire ceremony, overwhelmed by the beauty of seeing her daughter so happy and so loved. James and Clara became grandparents multiple times over, as David and Emily had 4 children, and Rose and Marcus had 3. The ranch house that had once seemed so large and empty now rang with the voices of grandchildren during holidays and family gatherings, and Clara took immense joy in spoiling them and watching them play. She taught them to bake cookies and sew buttons and identify different wildflowers, while James taught them to rope and ride and understand the land. The cycle of life continued, each generation building on the foundation laid by the previous one, and Clara and James watched it all with satisfaction and pride. On a morning in the spring of 1915, 33 years after that fateful day when their story began, Clara woke to find James already up and dressed. She could hear him moving around downstairs, and the smell of coffee drifted up to tempt her out of bed. She rose and dressed quickly, her movements a little slower than they once had been, but still capable and sure, and made her way down to the kitchen where James was preparing breakfast. "You are spoiling me," Clara said with a smile, accepting the cup of coffee he handed her. "I should be the one making breakfast for you." "You have made me breakfast for 33 years, James pointed out. "I think I can handle doing it once in a while. Besides, I wanted to surprise you. I thought we could take a ride after we eat, go check on the herd like we used to do when we were younger." Clara agreed immediately because time spent alone with James was still her favorite thing in the world. They ate a simple breakfast of eggs and toast, and then they saddled their horses and rode out together into the crisp morning air. The ranch had expanded considerably over the decades, now encompassing thousands of acres and multiple herds, but Clara still knew every inch of it as well as she knew her own face. They rode to the pasture where Clara had helped the calf all those years ago, and found themselves watching a similar scene unfold. A young heifer was pacing nervously beside her newborn calf, which was struggling to get its legs beneath it. Clara and James exchanged a glance, and without needing to speak, they dismounted and approached the pair. Clara knelt beside the calf, just as she had done 3 decades earlier, her hands still gentle despite the arthritis that had begun to affect her joints, and she spoke the same soothing words she had used back then. James stood beside her, not on a distant ridge this time, but right there as her partner, and together they helped the calf to stand. It took several attempts, just as it always did, but eventually the little creature was upright and nursing from its mother. Clara and James stepped back to give them space, and James slipped his arm around Clara's waist in a gesture that had become second nature over the course of their long marriage. "Do you remember?" Clara asked softly, looking up at her husband's face, which was lined now with age but still dear to her beyond measure. "Every detail," James confirmed. "I remember thinking you would be a good mother, and I was right. But you have been so much more than that, Clara. You have been my partner, my love, my best friend. You have made my life richer and fuller than I ever imagined it could be." "You did the same for me," Clara said, her voice thick with emotion. "You saw something in me that I did not even see in myself. You believed in me when I was struggling and scared, and you stood beside me through everything life threw at us. I could not have asked for a better partner or a better life." They stood together watching the mother cow and her calf, both of them thinking about all the years that had passed and all the memories they had made. They thought about their children and grandchildren, about the ranch they had built and the legacy they would leave behind. But most of all, they thought about the love that had sustained them through 3 decades of marriage, the love that had started with a simple act of kindness toward a wobbly-legged calf and had grown into something profound and lasting. As they rode back to the house, the morning sun warming their backs and the land stretching green and beautiful in all directions, Clara felt a deep sense of peace and gratitude. She had lived a full life, a good life, filled with love and purpose and meaning. And it had all started because a cowboy had stopped on a ridge one spring morning and watched a young woman helping a calf to stand, and in that moment had recognized something precious and worth pursuing. The years that followed were slower and quieter, as Clara and James gradually turned over more responsibility for the ranch to David and his family. They remained active and involved, but they also took time to simply enjoy each other's company and to appreciate the life they had built. They took trips to visit Rose and her family in the territorial capital, where she and Marcus had settled permanently. They attended graduations and weddings and baptisms for their growing number of grandchildren, and they spent countless evenings on the porch of the house they had shared for so long, holding hands and watching the sun set over the land they loved. James passed away peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1925 at the age of 69. Clara was devastated by the loss of her partner and the love of her life, but she took comfort in knowing that they had been blessed with 43 years of marriage filled with love and happiness. She remained on the ranch, living in the guest house so David and Emily could have the main house, and she continued to be an active presence in the lives of her children and grandchildren and even great-grandchildren who had begun to arrive by then. Clara lived for another 8 years after James's death, and when she passed away in the spring of 1933 at the age of 73, she was surrounded by family. Her last words were about James, about how much she loved him, and how grateful she was for the life they had shared. She was buried beside him in the family cemetery on a rise overlooking the ranch, where they could rest together forever with a view of the land they had worked so hard to build and protect. The ranch continued to prosper under David's management and eventually under his children's management, and the family never forgot the story of how it all began. The tale of Clara helping a calf to stand, while James watched and knew she would be a good mother, became a cherished piece of family lore, passed down through generations, as a reminder of the importance of kindness, patience, and recognizing the qualities that truly matter in a partner. The little bull calf lived a long life for a steer, eventually dying of old age at 14 years, and when he passed, the family buried him in a corner of that same pasture and placed a marker there to commemorate the role he had played in bringing Clara and James together. The love story of Clara Whitfield and James Mackenzie became legendary in that part of Montana, a tale told around firesides and at family gatherings. A reminder that true love can begin in the most unexpected moments and that a single act of compassion can change the course of a life. Their descendants continued to ranch the land for generations, always remembering the values of hard work, integrity, and partnership that Clara and James had modeled so perfectly. And every spring, when new calves were born and struggled to find their footing, someone in the family would inevitably tell the story again, keeping alive the memory of a woman who helped a calf stand on wobbly new legs and the cowboy who watched and knew she would be a good mother, and who loved her for it with all his heart for the rest of his days.